One single mistake could trigger a war. At first glance, everything seems contradictory. Iranian drones approach American ships. Fast boats harass an American tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. Yet both Washington and Tehran claim to want negotiations. This tension is neither distant nor theoretical. It directly affects what you pay at the pump, market stability, and the risk of a sudden global shock. On Friday, talks are scheduled in Oman regarding Iran's nuclear program. At the same time, the United States has already positioned at least 9 warships, dozens of fighter jets, and up to 40,000 soldiers in the region. The American president warned that the Iranian supreme leader should be, I quote, worried about this deployment. But here's what almost no one clearly states. This crisis did not start with the nuclear issue, and understanding this changes the entire perspective on what might happen next. What is at stake here goes far beyond a simple diplomatic meeting. Officially, this is about discussions on Iran's nuclear program set for Friday in Oman. That's the short, neat, and presentable version. But if you look at the actual timeline, something doesn't add up. Just a week ago, no talks were scheduled. Then almost suddenly, everything accelerates. Maritime incidents, forceful public statements, and behind the scenes, negotiations already threaten to collapse before they've even begun. Iran sets a clear condition: only discuss the nuclear issue. Washington responds that this will not be enough. Yet, the talks continue. The real question, therefore, is not what will be said at the negotiation table, but why this table exists now, why this urgency after months of deadlock, and more importantly, why this dialogue emerges precisely when military pressure is at a level rarely seen in recent years. This is where the story stops being just a diplomatic matter and starts to look like a test of strength. The United States' central claim is simple: pressure works, and they rely on very concrete elements to show this. At the very moment the talks are announced, the American military deploys at least 9 warships, dozens of fighter jets, and between 30 and 40,000 soldiers in the region. This is not discreet. This is not symbolic. And the message is publicly acknowledged. The American president declares that the Iranian supreme leader should be, I quote, worried about this military buildup. Fact. This statement is made while the talks are supposed to ease the situation. Fact. No specific timeline for concessions is announced. This contrast is deliberate. But notice what's missing in this show of force. There is no clear line about what happens if Iran agrees to talk but refuses to broaden the discussions. No official threshold, no final condition exposed, just rising pressure with no clearly defined exit. And it's precisely this strategic void that is beginning to concern many more players than just Washington and Tehran. And this is where things begin to spiral out of control, because this rise in tension is not new, but it feels strangely familiar. We've already seen this pattern: increasingly visible military signals, deliberately vague public statements, then a normalization of the idea that a limited action would be manageable. This time, the difference is the intensity: 9 warships, dozens of jets, tens of thousands of soldiers already positioned, all while Iranian drones and fast boats test red lines at sea. Such face-offs used to be exceptional. Today, they're becoming almost routine. And it's exactly this shift that's worrying. The more this kind of confrontation becomes normal, the more likely an error becomes. A misinterpreted incident, an excessive retaliation, a deterrent message seen as a provocation. This is how limited crises stop being limited. And while the focus is on the talks in Oman, something even more unstable is happening in the background. Here's the point that radically changes the way we understand this entire crisis. While Washington claims to want a comprehensive deal, the actions tell a different story. Fact. Iran set a clear red line even before the meeting. Talks must focus only on the nuclear issue. Fact. The United States had publicly declared that this would not work. Yet the talks continue. Even more revealing, American officials quoted by Al Jazeera confirmed that this first phase will focus only on the nuclear issue, with other topics postponed. This is a concession, even though it's never presented as such. The words speak of firmness, the actions speak of tactical retreat, and this contradiction is crucial because it shows that military pressure is not just aimed at Iran, but also serves to mask a more fragile reality. Washington wants to diffuse the situation, not escalate it. One thing is said aloud, another is negotiated quietly, and when this discrepancy appears, regional actors begin recalculating their own risks. From here, events no longer unfold slowly. They pile up. First, fact, it is announced that the talks are canceled. Then a few hours later, they are back on track. Then, fact, Iran publicly states that it has imposed a strict framework on the talks. Shortly after, confirmation comes that the meeting will indeed take place under these conditions. Meanwhile, fact, the United States maintains its maximum military deployment in the region. No withdrawal, no visible signals of de-escalation. Three dynamics are thus moving forward simultaneously with no apparent coordination: unrelenting military pressure, diplomacy shrinking back to essentials, and public rhetoric continuing to harden. This is not a linear strategy, it's an accumulation. And the more these elements accumulate, the more control becomes fragile. Because each player begins acting not according to a clear plan, but out of fear of losing the advantage. The question is no longer whether the situation is tense. The real question becomes much simpler. What happens if this dynamic doesn't stop? At this point, it's no longer about leaders or negotiators. This is about something that directly concerns you. Because when we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, we're not talking about an abstract map. Fact, a massive portion of the world's oil and gas passes through this narrow passage. Fact, oil tankers are already being harassed there. Fact, Iran is positioned to the north, and countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and Bahrain are aligned on the opposite shore. For them, a single incident could be enough to paralyze exports. And when these flows stop, it's not just numbers that move, it's prices, jobs, inflation, economic stability, not tomorrow, quickly. That's why these countries are putting intense pressure to de-escalate. They know they would be the first targets, even without being the real adversaries. And if all this feels familiar, that feeling that decisions made far from you end up affecting your everyday life, say so in the comments, because this machinery doesn't stop at the Middle East. To understand why all of this is possible, we must look at the system, not the rhetoric. What keeps this crisis alive is not a sudden will to go to war, but a perverse game of incentives. Each player has something to lose by backing down too quickly. Fact: Iran is weakened, nervous, scarred by brutally suppressed protests. Fact: the United States knows that military pressure creates leverage even without the immediate intention to attack. Fact: regional allies fear less a direct war than an economic collapse caused by a targeted strike. The result: everyone plays on the edge. The show of force becomes a negotiating tool. Diplomacy becomes a way to buy time, and public communication becomes a spectacle aimed as much at internal opinions as at adversaries. But here's the worrying point. This system works as long as no one blinks at the wrong moment. It doesn't require an irrational decision to explode. Just a bad calculation, misinterpreted pressure, fear that exceeds political control. And when a crisis relies on fear as its main fuel, it never ends cleanly. From now on, two paths emerge, and neither is stable. First possibility: fact. On Friday, both sides announced that they remain engaged in diplomacy. No deal, no breakthrough, just a commitment to continue talking. This scenario temporarily calms the markets, reassures Gulf countries, and allows everyone to say they've avoided the worst. But this calm is conditional. It rests on time. Fact: previous nuclear talks have taken months, and we also know that a delay can turn into a countdown. During the last comparable sequence, a delay was granted, and the next day, an attack occurred. Second possibility: talks fail quickly or stagnate. In that case, the already existing military pressure ceases to be just leverage. It becomes an option. Not necessarily a total war, but a limited action presented as controlled. This is often how escalations begin: slowly, then suddenly. And the detail to watch isn't what will be said in Oman, but the time frame that will be mentioned. 1 day, 30 days, 60 days. Because when a deadline is set, the next move is already being prepared. If there's one takeaway from this entire sequence, it's this. This crisis is not about nuclear weapons. The nuclear issue is just the language used to talk about something else. What's really at stake is managing time, fear, and the balance of power without losing control. Military demonstrations create credibility, negotiations buy time, and in between, each player hopes the other will blink first. So Friday is not an endpoint, it's a marker. A moment where everyone watches who backs down, who insists, and most importantly, who buys time. Because in this type of confrontation, time is never neutral. It protects some players and exposes others. And while the attention focuses on a meeting room in Oman, the real decision is being made elsewhere, in the timelines, the silences, and the options deliberately kept open. It is exactly in these gray areas that major geopolitical shifts are born. If you want to understand what happens next, you'll need to follow not the announcements, but the weak signals, and that's what we'll keep decoding here. Subscribe to not miss the rest.